So why did I embark on the journey? Well, first of all, when I was first employed in clinical education, we were employed as professional staff, so we weren't academics at the time. And then there was a restructure in the faculty that decided that actually we really should be academics and really starting to focus research around clinical education. So that was one of the reasons why I thought, maybe research might be for me. There was also a real growing need, and anyone who works in placements will know the demand for placements is huge. It's always a tough field. So at that time, there was sort of a real push to try and investigate alternative ways to deliver clinical education experiences for physio students, particularly in our area. Plus, I also started to have an increased personal interest in the use of simulation in physio education. Sorry, my down thing's not working. So I thought before I launch into where I was coming from, I'd just give you a bit of a background of the history of simulation in health education. So it's obviously been quite well established in medicine for a while. I think the advent of modern medical simulation was around the 1960s. There was much more, I guess, basic simulation methods prior to that, but simulation as we think of it today started around that time. And this used a lot of the past task trainers and mannequins things to help enhance student learning. I'm just going to move my picture because I can't see what's written. There we go. And there was also the need for students to have more realistic experience and the repeated practice of skills. So obviously, if you're learning to inject a patient, you can't do it 15 times on a patient. So having a means of having that realistic experience, but where you could do safe, repeated practice of skills was another onus for in medicine for the use of simulation. So that was sort of the mannequins and those things which you often think about with sim. But another thing that was developing around the same time by Harold Barrows was the idea of the simulated patient. So it was considered that it was an effective way to assess medical students' clinical skills using a standardized experience. So up until that point, you would assess their clinical skills on real patients. And as we know, real patients vary, they change, even, across patients or within patients. So in order for, I guess, fairness in assessment, but also consistency in assessment, the idea of having the standardized patient, which is actors playing the patient, was something that was introduced at around that time, and it was considered a high fidelity modality. So in physiotherapy, I guess we've been using simulation, I guess a low modality form for a really long time. We've all spent lots and lots of time in our undergraduate courses practicing on each other, which is a low fidelity form of simulation. But more recent times, there's been a bigger uptake of using the task trainers and the high fidelity mannequins like used in medicine and nursing is becoming more part of, I guess, the repeated practice of physio skills, again, in that safe, controlled environment. So the use of standardized patients in physiotherapy, I guess, was sort of started in the late 90s with the introduction of standardized patients for assessment in OSCEs. So I guess the same reasoning as for medical, in that it was standardized, students were all presented with the same case that presented the same way. So it was able to standardize the assessment. But then it was also identified that having the actor as opposed to the mannequin allowed students to also be assessed on things like their history taking skills, their physical examination skills and communication, which you can't really do with a mannequin. So from that started the PhD journey. So I thought, I really need to move this so I can read what I'm reading under here. Here we go. So just to give you a bit of a context and the aims of the research. So at the time when we started in 2012, and we started with a pilot study, which was the first study of the thesis, there was a really rapidly growing interest in using simulation, particularly with standardized patients in physiotherapy programs across Australia. At the time, we got a teaching grant, and that's when we piloted a model of simulation where we were looking at replacing the first week of a clinical placement with a simulation experience, with the idea that perhaps this, in being able to replace part of clinical placement time, we could somehow also increase student placement capacity. But as I said, this was something that was being taken up by lots of universities at the time. There wasn't a lot of research around it at the time, but there was certainly a growing body. And there was actually, not long after we did our pilot, a national study looking at a similar model, which kind of was a bit deflating because it's like, they're going to steal my thunder. But we certainly managed to, I guess, expand on the findings that they found in those particular studies. Whoop. Okay. So given there was lots and lots going on in that space and very similar sorts of research to what we were doing, we sort of looked for a few points of difference. At the time, there was a lot of simulation, and a lot of it was around, can it replace clinical placement time? So we also evolved and started to look at the concept of using simulation as preparation rather than replacement for clinical placement time. And I'll sort of allude to why that happened later on in the talk. The other thing that we were really interested in and wasn't deeply explored by the others was the clinical educator's experience. So when you're using simulation either to prepare for placement or replace placement time, major stakeholders in the whole thing is the clinical educators. So we really wanted to understand what their experience was of when students had simulation as preparation. The other thing that we looked at implementing was we used a generic simulation experience in two of our studies. So the initial pilot and a lot of the other studies looked at students undertaking a week of simulation in a very specific area of practice, and then they would go on to their placement in that same area of practice. What we wanted to look at was, if you just give students a generic simulation experience with lots of different cases and lots of different scenarios and lots of different settings, and then sent them off to lots of different clinical places, what impact did that have on their preparation? And I think the other thing we did too was focus more on the qualitative side of qualitative methods. So we really wanted to get a deeper understanding of what students' experience was, but also the clinical educators' experience. And so it begins. So our research questions was that we wanted to understand the impact of physiotherapy students, the impact on physiotherapy students' confidence and performance on their first clinical placement, if simulation experience replicating a specific clinical setting was used to replace clinical placement time. We also wanted to know what was the impact on the students' performance and confidence in their first clinical placement when they had that broader, I guess, more generic experience that covered several settings, and using this as preparation for all students, regardless of the setting that they went to after. As I said, we really wanted to understand the experience of the educators, considering they were pretty significant stakeholders in the whole thing. So we looked at their experience of both the replacement model and the preparation model. And we also wanted to understand the view of the student, the impact of simulation on students' confidence after they'd had their clinical placement. So up until that point, a lot of the questionnaires and had been focused on the students' confidence immediately after completing their simulation experience. What we wanted to understand was, did their view change after they actually had that experience? If that makes sense. So I'll go into that a bit more as we move on. So speaking of research journeys, this was all very new to me and something that I'd never considered before. But yeah, it was certainly something, and I think part of the PhD I've discovered a huge amount of pondering happens at various stages. And so I had to really have a think about sort of what was my worldview, where do I come from, how do I think, you know. And I guess I really like the epistemologically pluralistic approach. Really summed up, I guess, where I came from. So kind of reflecting on where I'd come from as a clinician, you know, I was very positivist, you know, it had to be RCTs and it was very clinical and it was, you know, very quantitative research that I'd sort of focused on as a clinician. But then as I became sort of more involved in education and certainly, you know, becoming an educational researcher, I also had this real desire to understand the experience of the participants. So employing more of that interpretive approach. So naturally it kind of fell into me being in the pragmatic worldview, and where mixed methods approach was certainly the most appropriate way to answer the research questions that we had for the thesis. So this is just a bit of an overview of, so the thesis, was the PhD consisted of 3 studies. The first one being the pilot that I talked about. And we had and so we looked at the master's students in our first group, which was a smallish cohort. And we also talked to clinical educators as part of that pilot. And we had lots of different outcome measures. So we had questionnaires for the students pre and post sim. We had preparedness questionnaires for the educators to complete. The APP scores, which I should have expanded there, but APP is the assessment of physio practice, which is the standardized assessment tool that we use to assess clinical performance on placement for students. And then we also had the focus groups and interviews, both with the students and the educators. So a lot of data coming out of that first one. And then we kind of consistently use similar outcome measures across the 3 studies. So in the second study where we swapped to the simulation as preparation, same cohort of students, well, not the same cohort, but second year GEM students. And again, using the questionnaires, the APP scores and interviews. But in our final one, where we looked at sim as preparation in our undergraduate students, we focused more on the qualitative. And this is where we're really interested in finding out their experience of simulation, or their thoughts of their experience in simulation after they'd had their clinical placement. Okay, so in our pilot study, so the research questions, we wanted to understand the impact of sim on the confidence of students before they started their placement. We wanted to see if we could replace a week of simulation, a week of placement with simulation without compromising the student's ability to become competent. So that was 1 week of a 5-week placement was replaced with simulation. And then we also wanted to get the educator's perspective on how prepared they felt the students were after that simulation week. So I think here, because this turned out to be a fairly big theme and topic through the thesis, was around preparedness. So we really had to look into, you know, what do clinical educators expect when it comes to students being prepared for placement? So a bit of a dive into some of the literature, kind of, it was fairly consistent, is that, you know, when students aren't suitably prepared for placement, it's stressful and it increases time demands on the educators, particularly in that early stage of placement. But clinical educators expect that, you know, obviously students have a sound theoretical knowledge that they come with, but they also want them to become prepared to apply this knowledge in the clinical setting. They also want students to be able to hit the ground running. Again, sort of that we don't really have that time. We want them to be ready to go. We want them to be confident, show interest and demonstrate that willingness to learn. And that was, yeah, a reasonably common theme, was that, you know, that they were enthusiastic, they had a good attitude towards learning, and that they were confident before they came. So just to give you an overview of the the simulated learning experience that we ran for the students. So that's a picture there of one of our, I think that was in our pilot. many years ago. So that's two of our students who are working with one of the actors who, as you can see, looks incredibly authentic. And so the objectives that we had for the week were, and this was for the pilot particularly, was that we allowed the students time to practice and receive feedback on their communication skills, manual handling skills, assessment and treatment of, we focused on cardiopulmonary and neurological patients, and also the clinical reasoning and practical skills. So the best model of SIM to meet these learning objectives, we thought, was using the standardised patients in that realistic clinical setting. Back in 2012, when we were back at Cumberland campus of Health Sciences, we didn't have a simulation setting to use. So we very kindly were offered to use the nursing facilities, which were way more flash than we ever anticipated, and certainly something we hadn't experienced before, because we didn't have anything like that at Sydney, at the Health Sciences campus at the time. So we developed cases that were based on real cases. We had actors employed to portray the patient. We considered the students to be a novice level. I hadn't done a placement before, so we developed the scenarios to be at that level of the learner. So we kept them relatively straightforward and not overcomplicated. The students were facilitated by academics and clinical educators, and they ran the briefing sessions before seeing the patient, provided feedback and provided debriefing. And we also set up peer observation and feedback activities. But importantly, the performance wasn't assessed. So it was purely a learning experience. We wanted the students to feel safe in a space where they could make mistakes, they could time out, and it was focus was entirely on learning rather than assessment. Okay, so the week was, underpinned very much by learning theory. There was a few learning theories that we identified as underpinning the simulated learning experience. So, a lot of overlap in these with things such as, learning from peers. It's that active participation. It's that engagement with meaningful activities. It's having learning embedded in the setting, self-reflection. Yeah, and all that was very much part of the learning structure of the simulation week. All right, so the experience of, so this was the first part of our study, which was the experience of the students in the pilot. So you can see there, we use explanatory sequential mixed methods. And we wanted to look at student confidence before starting placement, and also the outcomes of their assessments when a first week was replaced with simulation. So we had 16 students in the simulation group, and then we used 16 as a control. So the control didn't have the week of simulation prior to their placement. And the outcome measures, as I've touched on before, so there were confidence questionnaires, there was their assessment result, their final assessment results, and the post-simulation focus groups. So what we found from this group was that the confidence was significantly increased after the week of simulation in all areas. So the confidence questionnaire, which the students completed pre and post simulation, showed a significant increase in confidence in all areas. And the confidence questionnaire was pretty much made up of sort of was based on the physio practice thresholds. So things that the physios are supposed to do day to day, were they more confident to perform those after the simulation week? When we looked at the assessments of the students, the final assessments, when we looked at the sim group versus the control group, there wasn't any significant difference between the results for the students. So having that week replaced with simulation didn't impact their final assessments. And from the focus groups, the students, they love the experience. They love the authenticity. So up until that point, they've been working with each other. They've been working in the classroom. They really felt that this was an authentic experience. And a great way to facilitate that integration of what they'd learnt in the classroom into practice because of that realistic setting and using the standardised patients. They also commented a lot on the actual learning. So they really enjoyed the fact that there was a lot of time for self-directed learning. They spent a lot of time with their peers. They found really helpful. And they also enjoyed the scaffolding of the learning. So the fact that we could structure the week to gradually increase complexity as they became more confident. They really acknowledged that was a safe and effective way to learn in that space. So I've popped a couple of quotes up there, which I don't know if you can see. But yeah, so they, talking about confidence was increased, and about that, commenting on how it felt like, although they didn't learn anything new, they felt they'd learned a lot more because they were actually learning how to apply it. And also comments there on things like, the benefits of feedback and those sorts of things. So then the second part of our of the pilot was looking at the educator's experience. So again, this was another explanatory sequential mixed methods. And this time we wanted to look at what the educator's perspective were on the students' preparedness for placement once they'd done the simulation week. So 6 clinical educators took the students after the simulation week. And we also used 6 educators who had students who hadn't done the simulation week as a control. And they all completed a preparedness questionnaire saying when the students started with you, how prepared were they in different categories. They also obviously completed the assessment results. But we also did some post-placement interviews with the simulation group. So talked to the ones that took the students after simulation about their experience of having the students for one less week, but also how prepared they felt the students were after the experience. So it was a pilot and it was quite a small sample size, as you can see. So we did look at the preparedness questionnaires. Descriptive statistics didn't clarify any difference between the two. They seemed to think that they were similarly prepared with or without a simulation. Interviews, though, that dug a bit deeper found that they commented that the students were better prepared after simulation, but not at the level of week 2. So I think because this was simulation as replacement, they were thinking, okay, well, you've had a week of simulation, we've got your week 2. You should be prepared at a level of week 2. And they were certainly finding that wasn't the case. They had expectations about areas that students were better prepared were not met. So one of the things we did in this pilot study was we didn't disclose a lot of information about what we did in simulation to the educators. And so their expectations, may have been that they would have been able to, work perfectly well with patients with drips and drains, or their manual handling skills would be up to speed, or so their expectations were perhaps not met in some of those areas. A big one too was the perception of students having that 1 week less, which they found there was increased pressure on them as educators to get the students up to speed. So although they were slightly better prepared, they really felt that we're missing a whole week and we've now only got 4 to get the students up to that competent level. And they found that quite stressful. So from that, there was the suggestion that the sim might be better placed as preparation rather than placement for clinical time, which then led us into our second study. So again, there's a few quotes there referring to the fact that it was, it was a bit stressful having the 1 less week, and also that, maybe rather than replacing clinical placement time, it would be better embedded as preparation. Okay, so we went, okay, simulation is preparation instead of replacement. Let's have a look at that. But I had a year off. I was a bit busy, and so this was what I was doing for a year. And then I came back. So coming back, we looked at, and we certainly took on board the feedback from the educators about simulation as preparation rather than replacement. And we thought, well, let's have a look at, what happens to the student's performance if it's replaced. So we came up with the model of students having a week of simulation prior to their 5-week placement. And that was the model where, as I described earlier, was a more generic. So all of our students did it, regardless of what site they were going to afterwards, and they all were exposed to different types of cases and settings rather than the specific site, the specific sim experience that matched the experience they would have after. So again, we wanted to look at confidence of the student's perspective after the sim week. We wanted to get a sense of their preparedness again from the clinical educators, and we wanted to have a look at what impact it had on their final assessments as well. So this study was bigger because, as I said, we used all of our cohorts. So we were able to use the 167 master's students that went through the simulation, which is a big undertaking. They all did a week of simulation before placement. The previous year's cohort didn't have the simulation. So we were able to compare the assessments of the two cohorts, one having had sim, one not. We also had 6 clinical educators who we interviewed after the simulation group had done their placement to see what their perspectives on things were. And again, we looked at confidence questionnaires, assessment results, and some qualitative with the interviews. Okay, so findings from this study were that increases confidence, which is becoming a pretty regular theme now, both in our research and other research around the time. So I think it's pretty clear that having a really authentic experience prior to placement for the students really does increase their confidence before they start. So clinical educators reported that students were better prepared in their professional skills and their ability to engage in learning activities. So that was from the interviews we did with the educators afterwards. When we looked at the final assessment, so the assessment of physio practice of the cohort that didn't do the simulation, there was a slight, very small significant difference in the clinical scores. So the students who did the simulation week scored slightly higher on their clinical skills on the assessment tool than those that didn't do the simulation, but it was quite a small difference. So the other outcome was that the clinical educators reported that students' performance early on in placement was still impacted by that period of adjustment. So while they acknowledged that they were better prepared, they said they still did obviously have that time when they needed to adjust to that new setting. So again, there's some quotes from, so in this study, we did the interviews with the educators. So these were quotes from the educators who had the students after simulation. And these educators, most of them were quite experienced. So they'd had plenty of other students that they could draw comparisons to. So, often they said they were better with their communication skills, they were more confident, but they still also felt quite overwhelmed by coming into that new setting. Okay, so at this point we kind of went, right, we know students are more confident, seems to be an ongoing theme, but the confidence is always immediately after they've had sim. So they've had this fantastic experience, they're great, I'm ready to go. So what we wanted to find out now was, after they'd had their clinical placement, did they still think that the benefits of simulation helped them prepare, having had that experience? So our final study was with our undergraduate cohort, who had a week of simulation as preparation for placement. And the simulation model was the same. So it was that week with the standardized patients. So the participants, so we had 14 students who undertook focus groups and interviews so immediately after their simulation, but then also again after they'd had their clinical placement. So from these students, so again, they reported the benefits of, so after the focus groups after simulation, they reported that the simulation was beneficial. It increased their confidence. They really liked the ability to apply what they'd learned in the classroom in that safe, realistic setting. And after they'd had their clinical experience, when we did the post-placement interviews, they still acknowledged that they felt better prepared, and they do feel that I guess, moved over into their clinical placements, that confidence and that ability to communicate. And I think they appreciated that they'd had that chance to practice on the standardized patients before they got into the clinic. However, and this is probably to be expected, they still were not prepared for that unpredictability and stress of the real life setting. So even though we tried to, set up the setting as authentically as possible, present patients which were as realistic as possible, they still found it a lot more stressful in the real life setting. And based on that, they identified ways that sim might be altered to enhance that preparation for that unpredictability. One quote I really liked from one of the students was like, we could make it like a safe bubble not to feel good. So it was like, can we have those stressful scenarios, but in sim where we can make those mistakes and we can learn from them. So that was the end of our studies, and that was the start of COVID. So this was the time when I was trying to get it all together, and I was trying to, write it all up, write papers, crazy, and the world went pear-shaped. So this is just some pictures of things that I had done that time. So my poor dear mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. We had to move her not once but twice during the height of COVID. I had homeschooling, still working as in clinical education and trying to place hundreds of physiotherapy students in clinical settings during a pandemic, and writing a thesis. So it was fun. But anyway, we got through. So I guess the summary of what we found. So looking at the students, it was found that the safe learning environment had a positive impact on confidence, as I said, and that's supported by lots of other literature and studies. The main areas that were reported to increase in confidence was communication skills and that ability to integrate theory from the classroom into practice. They reported the benefits of the provision of feedback, the peer learning opportunities, and the benefits of being able to self-reflect during the simulation week. The interviews conducted with students after their clinical placement found that they still acknowledged that these were beneficial, but that it didn't prepare them for that adjustment period, unpredictability, and stressful aspects of the workplace. And from our clinical educators, they felt that students were better prepared in some areas of practice, and they acknowledged that they more readily engaged in learning activities such as peer learning and self-directed learning. They felt pressured not having time with placement, felt pressured not having students on placement for the full 5 weeks in the replacement model. And students were still required to adjust to the specifics of the workplace. This was more of my pondering. So they were better prepared, but how? So everyone, particularly educators, were often, yes, they were better prepared, but they found it very hard to put their finger on where it was. So after more pondering, one of the thoughts was that because the design of the simulation week embedded activities that are vital components of learning from experience, such as, we all know, active participation, feedback, peer learning, self-reflection, was it possible that the students were better able to engage in these learning activities? Well, they could engage in these activities in a context that reflected learning that they would have on the workplace. So the simulation experience was not just the clinical context for the patients, but also the learning context was much more, I guess, more what they would be experiencing in the workplace. So was it that as a result of this experience, students commenced placement with perhaps more enhanced feedback literacy, ability to engage with peers, the use of self-reflection to evaluate their own performance, which are all really important components of that experiential learning. So the learning activities enhance the students' self-efficacy in performing skills required for clinical placement, and that's resulted in their increased confidence, which is really important in seeking out learning opportunities when on placement. So experiencing what it's like to learn in the workplace may have covertly contributed to the students' confidence and increased level of preparedness. And therefore enable the students to adopt more quickly to the learning place. And that kind of goes back to the earlier points about preparation, where educators' expectations that the students engage in learning, that they're prepared to learn, they're willing to learn. Maybe simulation helped them understand how to learn. So I guess, this benefit needs to be made more explicit, particularly in student learning outcomes. When I go back to our pilot, we were very much focused on clinical and technical skills, but we didn't think so much about the benefits to students of those learning skills as well. The safe student-focused learning environment of simulation differences to the less predictable and often stressful situations students encounter on placements, and where patient outcomes and safety are prioritised. So it's that, it's that real tension between, we provide this really student-focused, safe environment in sim and think it prepares them for placement, but then they go out to where they're no longer the focus and patient safety is the focus. And so, does that contribute to that sort of adjustment period as well, where it's all about you, but now it's no longer all about you? So in conclusion, sim is good for preparing students for placement. They're more confident and they're better prepared as recognised by educators. The safe learning environment to apply their skills is in the classroom in a context reflecting the workplace is beneficial. Simulation was able to effectively replace clinical placement time, or it enhanced the outcomes for students who undertook simulation as preparation. Provided the opportunity to experience experiential learning, which may have contributed to them being better prepared to engage in learning in the real life setting. Was identified there were aspects of the workplace which simulation was less effective in preparing students, and additional aspects of preparation incorporated into simulation may equip students for real life settings. So I was looking at, do we need to supplement what we do in sim to prepare them for that unpredictability of the environment that they're going into? And that's what we sort of want to look to into the future is, what aspects does simulation actually enhance, and how do we make that more explicit, and how do we design sim to really make the most of those benefits, and I guess communicate that with the educators as well. Then I'm going very quickly. So just, and note on how things have changed. So it's now been 10 years we've been using sim in our physio program, and we have changed from that pilot. We now do include workplace learning skills as part of the learning outcome. We have introduced supplementary activities to address some of the gaps that sim we find doesn't really address. All our students continue to undertake sim as prior to placement. And across Sydney School of Health Sciences, all our programs, so all our allied health programs now have simulation embedded in their curricula, whereas prior to the pilot, there was none. Done. I need to acknowledge my brilliant supervisors. And that's my child now. That's how long it took me. She actually submitted it for me. That's her hand. So she wasn't even a thought before I started. So 10 years later, and yeah, without my amazing Gillian, Jenny and Lindy, my absolutely brilliant supervisors, I would never have got here. So thank you. And thank you for listening. There's my references.